There's heaps of ways that things can go wrong in the arm, and we'll cover a bunch of those today in the hopes that we can apply it for diagnosis and treatment of those issues. Starting by looking at the shoulder, so if we want to be able to externally rotate, we're going to need stability via the retractors of the scapula. So I guess this means that if we're struggling with external rotation, maybe we should look at things like the rhomboids. Now when we say external rotation, most people think of the rotor cuff, but there are actually some other structures that contribute to external rotation, like the posterior delt, and the posterior delt requires low trap function to activate fully. So it's a bit of a domino effect, but if we're lacking external rotation, part of it might be to do with the rear delt, and if we're lacking rear delt activation, part of that might be to do with the lower trapezius. Speaking of the trap, if we had paralysis in the upper trap, we can see some sort of issues with external rotation. I covered this in the last video, but just a little bit more depth on this is essentially what's happening is we'll try and activate through the external rotators, and apparently what's going to happen as a result of that is we're going to end up in some form of internal rotation. I'm not sure if this is relative internal rotation or it's fully going to drive internal rotation, but definitely we're not getting the movement we want to produce. Now, why external rotation is so important is it's involved in a bunch of different shoulder movements, but also is one of the things that's correlated with an impinged shoulder. So impingement is when you start jamming these bony structures against each other. Like they're not just rolling and sliding and gliding all nicely, they're actually like jamming and there's no movement. Right, that can really occur. So that's very painful and sort of blocks movement. So lack of external rotation, lack of posterior tilt, and upward rotation of the scapula all can contribute to this impingement. Additionally, it's been correlated with like a slumped posture and the associated pec minor tightness. Okay, so that's the shoulder. What about the rest of the arm, like the elbow? Something that really surprised me learning about the elbow is that the neutral position, where things aren't dysfunctioning, is about 15 degrees lateral to like the rest of your arm, like your humerus. So if it's going directly straight, you actually have a problem. And if it's really crazy out to the side, I could understand how that would be an issue, but I really thought it would be neutral. So that's called a normal cubitus valgus. Now, if it wasn't normal or we had some other sort of elbow issue, we might get inflammation in the joint. Now, that inflammation is going to be very painful, and one way to sort of get a relative relief from that, or a maximum comfort, is at about 80 degrees of flexion. It's going to have the most space in the joint, which means we're going to get more relief, because inflammation sort of fills up an area and it's like a pressure pain, and because we're creating space, we're going to sort of alleviate some of that pressure. Okay, looking at other issues with the elbow, let's say we can't completely extend it, it's a classic issue. This is correlated with issues in the elbow flexors. I think that's a really important point, not just for the elbows generally, but things get thrown around a lot in physio and exercise rehab space around what you should work on if something's a problem. Like some people say attack the issue directly, some people say don't chase pain, go for what's causing that. But what's causing that is, I think, a little contentious, a little contradictory at times. Like, for example, this information that I've gathered is saying we should work on the opposite side of what the issue is, right? Like, if we're not getting extension, it's because the flexors are too tight, as opposed to attacking the extensors directly. I think that's just a very interesting philosophical approach to rehab. Now, that's extension, but there's a bunch of other elbow movements. Even though everybody thinks of it as like a hinge joint, really it can do a lot more. Like, it can supinate and pronate, so it sort of rotates. If we're lacking range there, we can see some very interesting compensation patterns. So for example, if we're lacking range of motion and supination, we might see an external rotation compensation at the shoulder, whereas if we're lacking pronation, we might see an internal rotation and abduction at the shoulder as a way to sort of get to something approximating that movement. Now lastly, I just want to cover some laws of how these motions work. So one is the law of parsimony. It basically says that we want to take the most efficient route. It's a classic physics rule, where essentially we're going to activate the fewest muscular fibers and fewest muscles as possible to do a movement. And this is sort of another justification point for the Henneman size principle, which explains the order that muscular fibers activate in. And I think to some extent it also sheds light on why rehab can be so hard, because if you have a motor pattern set in place where something does activate to produce a movement even though it shouldn't, it doesn't really make sense for the body to try and activate something else simultaneously, even though that would be the correct movement. For those of you who aren't aware, I've been covering all of this and more as a part of my 50 Days to Rebuild challenge, where I read 50 pages of a physio or exercise book and do 50 minutes of exercise in a day in attempts to rehab myself, and all of this has come from Newman's kinesiology, and we're on day 43. Jumping into the exercise portion of things, I've been doing a bunch of things for my wrist, and it felt pretty good today doing all of that same thing, but later in the day I did notice some posterior lateral sort of pain, muscular tightness. I was able to mainly address this just by massaging it out, so I'm not too sure if that's, like I was saying, it's been overdone or if I'm doing something wrong, but perhaps I need to, not do it every day or cut back some of what I'm doing. And today's also the first day I've reintroduced the hip bridge since hurting my knee a few days ago. For the most part, it's feeling okay. It's not hurting my knee. My knee's generally feeling a bit better. And it felt pretty easy. It's still not perfect. Like, the whole thing is I'm trying not to activate my hamstrings. I'm really trying to get a glute dominant drive. But for the most part, like, it's getting there. And yeah, that is about it for day 43. Thanks for listening, and I'll catch you in the next one. Cheers.